Let's go ahead and get started here. Welcome everyone to session 2 of our TaxTalent Symposia group. Once again, my name's Adam Golden. I appreciate everybody carving out the time to join us today. Just a couple of things on how the agenda will go today. We want to take the first 5 minutes or so to kind of go around the room, if you will, and have all of the members do a little bit of an introduction. Some of the feedback that we received after the first session was that people would like to know a little bit about the other members of the group, so that if there's any shared experiences or things like that, we have a little bit of perspective of where people are coming from. So we want to take a few minutes to kind of go around and 20, 30 seconds at the most on name, company you're with, kind of level that you are in your department, and maybe a little bit about your background or something like that. So we'll do that here in just a second. Do want to remind you guys, we are going to have the Q&A after the session with Tony Santiago to answer any questions you guys have about the outsourcing white paper that we sent to you. I think it would have been week before last you guys would have received. So Tony will hang on after that. It's certainly not required or anything like that. And in fact, if you have to run, we will have another webinar that you can join that will also be a Q&A session, but it will be with the rest of the TaxTalent group, not just the Symposia group. So we wanted to give you guys first crack at Tony and getting questions answered, but if you have to run because of other meetings, we will make sure that you know when that other webinar will be so you can sign up for that. And then the third thing I want to talk about is just a little bit of a tease for our Symposia Session 3. I'm really, really excited about it. You should have gotten to save the date for November 27th. That's when the session will be. We are going to have actually a CFO by the name of John Briscoe, who is going to talk about defining, aligning, and measuring success. And we're also going to have a VP of Tax, Jim Parent, that worked with John Briscoe. The two of them worked at Weatherford together, and John hired us when he was brought in to clean up 2 financial restatements and 3 material weaknesses in tax. And then we ultimately ended up bringing on Jim Parent. So John and Jim have partnered together to clean up a department and rebuild it, and they'll be able to talk about their experiences in terms of success and how you define it, align it with the business, and measure it. So if you want to make sure you guys have that on your radar, because that's going to be a really good session for you to attend. So with that in mind, I'd like to start by kind of going around the room. Everybody's microphone should be open to chime in here, and whoever wants to break the ice and go first, tell us a little bit about yourself, who you are, what company you're with, and so forth. So I'll kind of open the floor. That, or I can start calling out names because I can see everybody that's signed in.
This is Don Marr. I'm a tax lawyer with Dow Chemical.
Thanks, Don.
Hi, everybody. It's Sam Caulfield, Director of Tax Accounting with Sempra Energy.
Hello, everybody. Hi. This is Derek Cyprian, Vice President of Tax at Scientific Drilling.
Hi, this is Cynthia Hablinski. I'm the America's Treasurer at Shell Oil Company, previously in tax.
Hi, this is Chris Peterson. I'm the Chief Tax Officer at Bunge.
Hey, Chris, this is Dwayne Schroeder, and I'm Vice President Tax here at Medtronic.
And my name is Dawn Reynolds, and I'm the Senior Director of Tax Operations at Greif.
Hi, everyone. I'm Amanda Bruner. I'm the Director of Global Tax at Hollister Incorporated.
Hi, this is Nicole Busey. I'm the Tax Director over Indirect Tax Compliance and Planning at Marathon Petroleum Company.
Hi, everybody. This is Kelly Lawler. I am the Senior Director of Global Tax at SWM International.
Hi, this is Rob Laudeman, Senior Director of International Tax at Bayer, formerly Monsanto.
Hi, this is Kim Stosky. I'm the Director of Global Tax Reporting with Brown-Forman Corporation.
Hi, this is Chris Oster. I'm the Vice President of Global Tax Planning at CBRE.
This is Jamie Porcio. I'm the Vice President of Tax Compliance and Accounting at FedEx, in charge of U.S. income tax compliance and the audits associated with U.S. income tax. I'm also oversight over our global tax provision processes for our public financial statements. I report to our head of tax at FedEx.
Hi everyone. John Moore, Senior Director of Tax Planning and Strategy at Baxter Healthcare.
Hi, this is James Butler. I'm America's Tax Director and Tax Counsel at Diageo.
Hi, this is Marina Soloway. Not sure if you're hearing me now because it didn't seem like it was working before. I'm Chief Tax Counsel with Xylem.
Hi, Marina. We hear you. We hear you loud and clear.
Cool.
Is that everybody?
Justin McGue, Director of Tax Planning at 3M Company.
Hi, Joe.
Mark Staub here from Comores Company.
I think that's it. I'm going through the list here. I think everybody's chimed in. Hopefully that gives everyone a opportunity to at least get a feel for the companies that are represented and the levels of the people that are the participants. So Mike, I will turn things over to you. You guys remember Mike from our first session. He was the former head of tax at FedEx and has been actively involved with us in helping design the curriculum here for Symposia and helping us out. So you guys heard the introduction last time. I'm not going to go into that. We'll just get right into things. Mike, the floor is yours.
Great. Thank you, Adam. Jamie, good afternoon. I know many of you on this call, and obviously given the list of attendees here, like I said the last time, this is a terrific group, in my opinion, terrific group of high-powered tax people, which can make these sessions much more valuable for you all, just that fact alone. I urge you to reach out to each other and develop some relationships. You know, there's an old saying, it's lonely at the top, and it really is true. As a #1 tax person or as a #2 tax person, there are simply some matters you cannot talk with a lot of other people about in your department, in your companies, in your families. And one of them we're going to touch on today, which is tax organizational matters. You know, these matters are so confidential, proprietary, and sensitive in a lot of regards that you simply cannot talk with the population at large or your friends or whatever. But think about who's on the phone here with, or who's on this webinar with you here today. And I venture to say that many of you are going to be going through the same kinds of issues, not the same specific issues, but the same kinds of issues in the next few years, and the same kinds of processes and hurdles and frustrations and so on and so forth. And as you go through that, if you reach a difficult point, think about reaching out to some of these people on the phone here. You know, Tony and Adam have put a terrific resource at your fingertips. How much value you derive from that resource, it depends on how you manage that now and possibly for quite a few years into the future. Anyway, I'll get off my soapbox. In our last webinar, we discussed 2 fundamental questions you needed to answer to be successful in ascending to or performing in a #1 tax position. And those 2 things were, #1, what are the critical success factors for that position and the #1 tax position? And #2, how many of those success factors do you currently have and can you market? And how many do you need to work on, do you need to strengthen? But today we are going to change gears a little bit. And instead of talking about the #1 tax position success factors, we're going to talk about the tax department as a whole and its critical success factors, or if you want to phrase it differently, its objectives. Your task as a #1, and we're going to be focusing primarily on that today, on the person sitting in that #1 chair, your task is to manage your department to successfully meet or preferably exceed the department objectives, which written correctly, done correctly, ought to be in perfect alignment with the objectives of the person sitting in that number one chair. So in this regard, then, we have the same starting point we had that we discussed in our last webinar. And Adam, if we could go to slide number 4, please. Yeah, so we have the same starting point, which is to define, document, and align the critical success factors / objectives for your department and identify your department's key stakeholders. We spent a lot of time talking about this, so I'm not going to go over that again here. I will say that as you're doing this for your department, immediately address any significant conflicts between the personal success factors for that number one position and your departments. You can expect some differences. For example, you as a number one may have some personal growth objectives, or like we talked about last time, you may have an objective to strengthen your communication skills, et cetera, et cetera. But overall, your objectives ought to be very parallel with those of the department. And I emphasize this, it seems like a simple point, and it really is, but it's also a very important point, because if your objectives for that number one position are in conflict with the department, it's a recipe for disaster. I mean, your department's going to be pulling one way trying to meet its objectives, and you're going to be pulling another way trying to meet your objectives. So you need to address that right away. Okay, next slide.
And Mike, if I could, just
sorry.
to point out in relationship, no problem, to your first bullet and the define, document, align. One thing that we implemented on our new hire processes, on our onboarding, right in our documents, we identify all their key stakeholders. We set up meetings with them so that they can meet them, or we do a group meeting if it's a lower level position, so that if they can get introduced, and also put together, their, call it 3 months, 6 months, 9 months objectives. So that HR partnered with us to do that. That's very, very effective. It takes a little pressure off of the manager in charge as well, because they get to know people pretty quickly and they know what's expected of them pretty quickly. So just to add that point. And then the other thing that I thought was really good, the second bullet related to the conflicts, related to your fit with the organization. And this will define actually, your length with the organization and where you see yourself fitting from a short-term perspective and a long-term perspective, and those key hires that you make to ensure that you increase your longevity with an organization. So those are just some points that we've had some success with.
Good points. Okay, next slide then, Adam. We also talked about this last week as well, but I'll just repeat it. Minimize areas of disagreement between you and your stakeholders. Obviously, we're talking about department objectives here instead of number one position, but same thing goes for your department objectives. Minimize those areas of disagreement. Clearly identify roles and responsibilities for gray areas that might cross departmental lines. A couple we talked about last time were payroll taxes, which might roll up to the payroll group, and international taxes, some of which may be done by your accounting group in the foreign countries in which you operate. I think, Kelly, you had another example.
Yeah, there's the legal department where you contract with tax attorneys. It's important because your legal general counsel expects you to ensure that they are the one contracting with the general counsels, the tax attorneys and the tax law firms. So I stumbled upon that one and had to right size it and ensure that we had all engagement letters with tax firms, tax law firms running to the general counsel.
And one thing you hit on here, Kelly, too, is, and we talked about this last time, I'll just touch on it again here. As a number one, you have to maintain decent relationships with anybody that your department relies on or interacts with in any significant manner. There are always going to be personality conflicts, but it's your responsibility to get past those personality conflicts and make that position, that number one position, as effective as it possibly can. When we're talking about the department here, we're not talking about just you. We're talking about all of your people too. So they're relying on you to be able to do that. And that's just what Kelly was just talking about, whether it's legal, whether it's HR, whether it's accounting, whether it's some operational group, whatever. Key metrics, sorry?
Yeah, they really are. And one other point I'd add to that is one thing you could also do is get your controller, and I know everybody has, data requests are probably one of our biggest obstacles, right? One thing you can do, we did a roadshow with our corporate controller to the different locations, non-US locations, and go through certain requirements of the data request, and you kind of hold hands and buy into the data that's needed from his direct reports that are actually coming into tax. So that's just another way where you can break down barriers and partner with those other leaders of your other departments and your peers and bridge those gaps for your department to be successful.
Okay. The key metrics for your department should be as specific as possible, just like, again, we talked about last time. Specificity is your friend. Ambiguity is your enemy. Don't forget, these will define your success or failure in your role. And in this case, your department's success or failure against its objectives. So make them as specific as you can. Some of these are difficult to make specific, but nonetheless, do the best you can. These are just examples, and they're exactly the same examples that I included the last time, based on my experience, based on my discussions with the heads of tax for a lot of Fortune 500 companies. I'd be surprised if you have all of these as your department objectives, but I would also be surprised if you don't have at least some of them. You don't want all of them, I don't think, because it dilutes the mission too much, but you need to have some of these, or you probably do have some of these. And I don't think we'll go through those. Why don't we go to the next slide there, Adam? Well, okay, so this is a good break point. If you have any questions to this point, again, most of this we talked about in some manner last time. If we have any questions to this point, let's talk about, let's bring them up. Otherwise, we'll move into the tax organization aspect of today's session. Anybody have any questions? And you don't have to start, you don't have to ask them now or at the end of the session, by the way. If you have them as we go along, feel free to log in or break in and ask them. All right. Well, hearing none, let's move on. So once you know what you must do, i.e., you know what your department's objectives are, you need to assess, as a number one, you need to assess your department's ability to do it. You're going to have to assess it from three perspectives: technical, leadership, and organizational. Technical skills, leadership skills, and the organizational capabilities of the department. Again, we talked about technical and leadership the last time. We spent a fair amount of time on that. It's basically the same kind of concepts. Organizational is new, and we'll get into that. But in my opinion, your technical and leadership assessment will require, of your department, will require a position by position evaluation, top to bottom of the department. In other words, you have to look at every position in the department and assess what the technical skills of the individual currently holding that position are, and what the leadership skills of that individual are. My advice is that for your first time as a number one tax person, you should be directly involved in the assessment of people at least 2 to 3 levels below you. You have to be for the level directly below you, right? Because you got to do their personnel evaluations on whatever basis your company requires. And I suggest that for this first time, you be involved in another couple of levels below that. I know it's time consuming, but it is, trust me, one of the most important tasks you will undertake. And it will determine, again, your department's success or failure in the future, and therefore your success or failure into the future. And once you've done that, don't just set it aside and say, okay, I've done it, it's great. Periodically review it and update those assessments that you have for those different positions. All right, next slide.
Hey, Mike, I think Derek had a, Derek, I think that was you that had a question.
Fire away, Derek.
And I think you're muted now, Derek. Let me unmute you. Well,
can you hear me now?
Yes.
I can hear you.
Yeah, sorry about that. Yes, no, I'm sorry. And I was jumping ahead and I was listening and not really looking at the slide, but Mike ended up answering the question, so we're good. Thank you.
Oh, okay. Got it.
Okay.
All right.
All right. As you're going through this department-wide assessment, one thing that I would suggest, I think that if you have a department-wide succession planning tool, other companies call it different things, high potential review process, anything like that. If you have that, it can make your technical and leadership assessment more effective and efficient. I'm a strong, strong believer in this. And if you don't have any, I would urge you to seriously consider implementing one. These kinds of processes help you and your management team really identify those who do have the skills you need or can get the skills you need to move your department to the next level and have your department achieve its objectives. Not only that, but succession planning serves as a tool for the seamless planning of leadership transfers, not only today, but perhaps potentially many years into the future. I'm a big, strong proponent of that. And again, if you have it, make use of it in this technical leadership assessment. If you don't, then I would get it. Your assessment.
And then,
yeah.
One added point to that, Mike, is if you do have that laid out for your employees, one thing it'll help you with and benefit you with is where they're asking you for training and development. That'll allow you to show them, okay, so this is what we're planning to develop, areas we're planning to develop you in. And so then it'll go hand in hand with the training plan that you expect of them, and they won't be deviating into other areas if they know what they're supposed to be going after.
Yeah, totally agree. Totally agree.
The one thing we also see with our clients, Mike, I just wanted to add, the one thing we also see with our clients and we encourage with our clients is to also make sure you have the conversations with your people about the direction that they also want to go, because there are instances sometimes where the department has needs or the organization has certain needs, but the needs of the individual may not align with that. And the sooner as a head of tax you can know that, the more you can anticipate when you might have turnover or when you might have someone that's outgrowing your organization, and you can start to be able to manage any kind of surprises you might get with turnover that might come up.
Yeah, that's exactly right, Adam. I mean, when we used to do it, and I presume FedEx is still doing this, we would have our top management team get together once every year, and we would do a review of the entire department. It started with the manager level, and we would identify, where we had gaps or weaknesses in the department, and who might be able to fill those gaps or weaknesses in the future. But you had to know what those people's objectives were too. And that's where somewhere down the line, there had to be some discussions between those people and their managers to ensure everybody was aware of what they wanted to do or could do. And if you're not aware of that, then you might be counting on somebody to do something that's not going to happen. Good point.
Hey, Mike, this is James.
Anyway,
we still do that process, by the way, once a year, where we have our succession planning meetings, and we go all the way down to the manager level and assess, our department to fill needs. I'd like to add.
You're a fan of that as well, still, Jamie? I mean, you were
oh yes. You need to know your pipeline, and we talk about all of our manager candidates and director candidates, and it really is a good process because it identifies areas where you might be weak in, and you can focus on those. At FedEx, it's no secret we went through a major acquisition about 3 years ago, and our tax structure, Mike, today looks probably a little bit different than what you remember. In that, I mean, we had to restructure our business. Well, we had to restructure from a tax perspective our organization, legal entity structure to accommodate an acquisition like that. And it's more complicated as well. And so your needs change. And so what we have been wrestling with really over the last couple of years is, what do we need today versus what we needed 3 to 5 years ago? And it is different. And, the stakeholders, as Mike was talking about, when you think of, who we report to as a tax department and who we have to work with, it's nice to have a seat at the table to communicate on a regular basis with executive management the challenges that you face. Because as our organization has changed within the tax department, as our structure has got more complicated, our needs have changed. So that requires resources. It requires, you know, the people that you have on staff when you're going through that may not be able to handle what's coming down the pipe. So you got to backfill that somehow, whether it's advisors, whether it's temporary staffing, one way or the other. You can't allow yourself to not have the resources to handle the compliance requirements, the planning requirements, and put people in place to handle what's coming down. So there could be some contingency plans. And so part of what we're doing here is there's the short-term needs, which you know, you may not be able to handle all internally, but what is the plan to get there? And part of our succession plan processes identifies where we need to be. And so there's where do we need to be from a people perspective? Who do we need to bring in? Do we need to go out and source the market for additional internal resources that we want to eventually take these processes in-house? And how do we build the people up, and how do we do some knowledge transfer to the extent that we have advisors that are helping us get over this hump, so to speak? How do we, in a year, 2 years from now, take that back in-house for some of those key processes that we may be relying on outside advisors to do? So this one for us is an evolution, but it is so important, and make sure that you're talking with your executive management so that you line up those resources, because they will be needed if you go through a major organizational change like we have.
Yeah. It's a great points, Jamie. Great points.
We did have a question come in from someone beforehand, and I can't remember if the person was planning to join the session or not, but it kind of deals with this, and it basically said our department has limited resources in the tax accounting area, and you know, how can we address financial reporting and educate the company if they aren't familiar with the technicality of tax accounting to get the resources that we need? You know, I don't know if you have any insight into that, Mike, or even Jamie on your side of the fence as you guys are going through that. If your company doesn't understand the level of technical issues that you have, how do you educate them and get the buy-in to get you the adequate resources?
Well, actually, frankly, that is an issue that has been around for tax departments from time immemorial. You know, tax is a very specialized area, and really, frankly, very few people in the company fully understand what it is that tax departments do, particularly in large companies like all of you here. What it is that tax departments do, what they're responsible for, and you know how much risk we're managing and how much value we can create. Really, there are very few people. I was fortunate, I know Jamie feels the same way. I had a CFO who did understand that. And, you know, but I know, as we talked last time, there are times that CFOs are kind of parachuted in from the operations or whatever. And I can assure you, a lot of them don't understand that. I can also assure you, a lot of the HR departments don't understand that. But it's a hurdle that, or an issue that all of us have to deal with. And the best advice I can give is you have to keep hammering away at it. Always push on the value side of things, but also make them understand what the risk is if you don't get these kinds of resources. And if you need them, you just have to keep pushing at it. You know, I always felt the best way to do it was first through HR, if you could manage that. If they're going to just be a complete roadblock, then sometimes you have to take it up over their head, go to your boss, and try to get it done that way. I don't know if Jamie or anybody else has any suggestions.
I've had some of the same problems, Mike, and we have one of the toughest structures in the country, and most of our issues go to Washington National. So what we had to do actually was get involved with our auditors, such that because our issues are so complex and because we've got a lot of foundation work to build, and you know, there's certain things that the auditors will be able to give you a pass on versus ones that they'll dig deep on. If you get an order of magnitude and issues that that you need to hit on and the timing at which you need to hit them. And you can get your auditors, the partner, the tax partner, to have a conversation with your CFO, and you guys all sit down and talk about, you know, the level of complexity, the volume, the resource needs. Our auditing firm was very, very helpful and instrumental in talking with also the audit partner and the CFO and getting us the level of complexity and resource requirements front and center in front of the CFO, and so that we could get the resources we needed. So that's been very helpful.
Particularly for tax accounting, because that is an area, we have a slide at the very end of this, we may be covering most of it here, but you know, that is an area, even sometimes it's within the tax department, sometimes it's not. But whatever you do, your department does from a strict tax standpoint can have incredible effects on your company's financials. And this is where your company can get into a lot of trouble if you don't have the right resources devoted to it, either in your department or in the accounting department or somewhere else. And so, yeah, that's a good way of doing it. A lot of times, if that's where you're going, you may be already in trouble, though, if you're calling on your auditors to do that. But, you know.
Yeah, well, thankfully, I walked in the door with, you know, a lot that was on the table and needed to be handled. So I was given the time and ability to do it. But the other thing that we did do is we partnered with an outside consultant whose specialty is tax accounting, and he's as good as Washington National in this area, and can really build up the strength in your department in tax accounting, and you can hit key specialized areas and spend your money wisely. And so if you can find those, you know, tax accounting specialists, those are good to have as a someone you can reach out to on a frequent basis and do contract support for your function. So if anybody needs that resource information, I can provide that as well.
I presume it's still pretty hard to find really good tax accounting people. Is that right?
I would say it's hard, most definitely, but I think it's getting harder because of what we're facing in U.S. reform. So I think that I think a lot of the experts in the area and the very experienced people, I think we're losing, you know, we're shedding a bit of talent out of our baby boomer generation. That's going to be, you know, creating a bit of a deficit for us. And I think the rules that we're having to deal with that counteract each other are going to make tax accounting very counterintuitive. Even as technical and complicated as it is, the results that come out is going to create a lot of volatility for all of us to deal with.
Yeah, makes sense.
Hey, Mike, this is Jamie. I would like to echo that. Now, we, you know, our external auditors actually played a part. I actually was able to get approved additional, additional heads, if you will, additional employee positions in my organization in the tax accounting area. A lot of it had to do with coming, you know, as part of the structure we're putting in more complexities. You know, when the auditors do their scoping for their audit plan each year, they list all the things that they're going to look at it. And for us, tax accounting was very prominent. And so it came up naturally in conversation with our CFO regarding just tax accounting expertise, the need for, okay, you guys are doing a good job, but you know, we could see where all these issues you might need a little bit more, and we leverage that. So, you know, I don't know that I would recommend going directly to your auditor about it, but you can use what the audit plans that they put together for your company could indicate an increase in level of complexity that you might be able to point to help that story.
Yeah, it's a great point. You know, the other thing, and it may be too long gone now, but you know, tax reform helped most companies. I have to believe almost everybody on this webinar has a lower ETR this year than you did last year because of tax reform. Well, that didn't just happen. There were a lot of people who worked on that, and you ought to claim some credit for that. And somehow mix that into your discussions with your CFO. Look how much value we've created here. Give us some of that value back, because things have just gotten a lot more complex for us because of tax reform. and these other consequences that we have, like reorganizing, like Jamie's talking about, and we need some of that money back to staff up appropriately. Now, you may be too far down the road since that happened to effectively do that now, but I don't know. It's a possibility still.
And just one more opportunity you could consider as well is using your internal controls team to help you in ensuring that you have proper controls, and then also those controls kind of lead themselves into reporting and creating efficiencies by utilizing resources outside your department in both the reporting and the FP&A teams. So if you can get efficiencies out of their data pulls and automate some of your work, and also get some assistance from internal controls to ensure you have got the proper controls set up. Those are some other things that we've done in the past as well.
Good.
I will bring Ahmed Roubaix into one of these conversations because I think the sales aspect of selling this to upper management is so critical. I've had this discussion hundreds of times. Ahmed was a chief tax officer at a very young age. He's now basically retired. He works on boards. He moved into a CFO role. He moved into a CEO role, worked with a major private equity group, but his career was tax. And he was able to, in a way, I think, negotiate resources at a level I've never seen before. So I'm going to personally get him to do me a favor, come on and speak to this group here at one of our sessions. And it won't be long. Ahmed will spend 15 minutes, but he'll give you how he did it and how he'd recommend you do it when communicating to leadership and financial management. He's lived in both worlds. He's, like I said, an amazing individual. So we'll tease you with that one. When I bring Ahmed on, I think he'll give you some insight on how to do this effectively and sell it to management and to the board.
That's a great idea, Tony. There is a skill set to that. Don't sell that short. There is a skill set. And if you fail at it, then you're failing not only yourself, but your department. Okay, why don't we move on there, Adam? Next slide. All right, so concurrent with identifying who has the skills necessary to achieve your department objectives. So we're talking about this assessment, technical leadership assessment, position by position throughout the department. Some of them more complex than others. But anyway, concurrent with that process, you need to determine your necessary organizational changes to maximize your department's effectiveness. And this is kind of what Jamie, not kind of, this is what Jamie was talking about. He's talking about it on a really macro, on a maximum, from a maximum standpoint. There are smaller reorganizations, but in his case, you were looking at not only reorganizing the entire tax department, but reorganizing the entire company in a lot of regards. And when you do this, consider seeking input, from different people. I've listed a few positions here. Obviously, the CFO, who, again, I presume most of you are reporting to. If not, then whoever you do report to, if it's the general counsel. Possibly the chief accounting officer, possibly the treasurer, M&A chief, particularly if you've done a major reorganization and there's a lot to be done as that, not organization, acquisition, as that acquisition is brought online, probably need that individual's input. Possibly the general counsel, operations VPs, et cetera. Your list will vary depending on what your circumstances are. I would suggest, I would caveat here, beware of the lack of understanding of tax, like we just talked about, and or ulterior motives that some of these people may have. If it's the M&A chief, he or she may want your department focused on what is going to meet his or her objectives and their department objectives, and not necessarily taxes objectives. So you got to be very careful who you talk with and how much stock you put into their input. I also, if you're going through a major, if you're going through a major reorganization because of a big acquisition, and everybody knows this is going to happen, then it's obviously public knowledge. But some of the details you're talking about you have to be very careful about who you talk those details over with. You cannot have a whole bunch of leaks about what your plans are in terms of reorganizing your department, because if you do, those people who are not going to be the winners at the end of the day in that reorganization, I guarantee you will do things to try and undermine the plans if they get wind of those plans. So you've got to be cautious on, again, who you talk with, what kind of stock you put into the advice you get, and how many people you talk with. As you're going through these things, and I think someone touched on this, consider external information. Benchmarking is a good possible source of information. In a lot of cases, for companies who just provide generalized benchmarking information, I found it to be of limited value, and maybe even less than limited value. But then there are firms like Tony's here who provide specialized benchmarking designed to look at your specific situation. Those can be extremely helpful. And if you need help in selling it, like we were just talking about, to the CFO, to HR, to someone else, one of these kinds of studies can be extremely helpful. Consider talking with other firms, other companies. Again, what did we talk about at the beginning of it, or what I talked about at the beginning of this session? Reach out to people on this webinar. Somewhere down the line, say, what's your kind of structure? What have you done here? Have you faced this situation? What have you done? There's a wealth of knowledge out there. There's a wealth of knowledge amongst all of you on this webinar right now. Big Four firms, I found that they've been a wealth of knowledge as well. They are embedded, for lack of a better term, in most of your companies, if not all of your companies. And while they can't talk about proprietary information, obviously, they can talk about general organizational types of approaches that they've seen in other companies. And they can give you an idea of what maybe you want to consider for your own particular reorganization. Old mentors can also be a real help here. I had one when I became head of tax at FedEx, and he stayed with me for many years. He'd come down to Memphis every once in a while just to have dinner or breakfast and ask me what was going on and give me a little advice here and there. So consider all those kinds of sources of information. And I think, again, Jamie mentioned, or Kelly, consider in-house employees versus outside advisors. All this depends on your company's mission, timetables, headcount restrictions, et cetera, et cetera. A piece of things you need to consider as you're putting together your organization. Next slide.
And I will echo, Mike, if on the benchmarking, that we used both public information, we used Big Four information, and we also used Tony's group. And even all of the above have to be scrutinized pretty heavily to kind of draw out one, whether it's an inbound or outbound, two, whether how much outside outsource work is being done. And so while it's all good information, you have to really analyze the data and interpret it for your bosses, your CFOs, general counsels, whoever you're getting approval with to hire. And also you have to also palette the studies with what is coming out of your HR team and how to educate them as well. So I agree with what Mike's saying, is this benchmarking data is good, but you have to really get underneath it.
Absolutely. I mean, I used all of them, and I suspect all of you do as well. I mean, you don't want to look at just one area, but all of them, and you've got to choose the right mixture. Okay, so this slide presents the way I would go about a major reorganization. And you all may have different perspectives, you may have different opinions, love to hear them if you do, but this is how I went about it. Based on this departmental assessment, your technical, your leadership, and your organizational assessment of your department as it exists today, and where it has to go, i.e. its objectives, then what I would do is develop an optimal tax organization, i.e. the organization that I would most like to have if all the sun, the moon, and the stars all aligned, and I could have limitless budget. Then I would scale it back to a realistic best structure. And I'll tell you, by the way, in this regard, I rarely tried to work these things during the week. I had an open door policy, and people could come in and out of my office whenever they wanted. And if you have organization charts sitting out on your desk, you're going to generate a lot of questions. Just too many interruptions, too many people, too much risk. So I didn't do it then. I would come in on a weekend, and I had a different policy on the weekend, which is my door was closed, my time was mine. Don't interrupt me. I'm going to do whatever it is that I need to do for my job. And if it was a major reorganization, I'd come in early on a Saturday morning and I would have an objective of being out of there by whatever time. And when I walked out of the office Saturday evening or Sunday night, whenever it was, I would have 2 organization charts in my hand, the optimal and then the realistic best structure. Once I had those, then I would vet the realistic best structure, but I would also take the optimal with me as my backup. I'd vet that realistic best structure with first those who will have a major influence on it, and that includes HR. You know, I've never talked to one tax #1 person who has not had issues with HR. We've all had issues with HR. We will always have issues with HR. The problem is HR is just enforcing the laws of the country and the company's policies. So, you know, they've got a job to do as well. And we as tax people have to understand that. They don't understand us as well as they do a lot of other places. They'll understand, you know, operations a lot better generally than they will tax. So it's our job to educate them. But at the end of the day, if you have a major reorganization and you don't have HR on board, you've got a big problem. So you need to vet it with HR, obviously swear them to secrecy, and they're going to push back, but then you need to push back and say, yeah, but what's fatal in this plan that I have? I don't want to hear what your preferences are, because I know my preferences better than you do. I know what we need to be able to operate. I want to know if you see any fatal flaws in this. And, you know, you might adjust it around the edges for preferences they have, but obviously you would have to adjust it if they have a fatal flaw, if they identify a fatal flaw. But then also address or vet it with a few people. And in my opinion, I think the fewer the better here. And these few people would be key people in the tax department, 1 or 2 key people that you know as a #1 you're going to have to rely on to make this reorganization work. I wouldn't go very much beyond that. And then, you know, key couple other people, maybe of some of your clients or other departments throughout the company. That was my perspective on it. I tried to limit the number of people. I don't want to limit the input, but I limited the number of people at this point when I have charts in front of me. I want to limit the number of people who know what it is that we're doing, because I want to limit the number of leaks. Once you've adjusted your realistic best structure for the input you obtain from these people, then take it to your boss, obviously. And in this regard, again, a simple suggestion, which I'm sure all of you follow, but in case you haven't, make sure it's not the first time your boss has heard about your reorganization, especially if it's a major one. You know, if I had something major going on, I would let my boss know early on, this is what I plan on doing. I don't have all the details in place, but objectively, here's where I want to get. And I'm going to try to get there, and I'll just kind of bring you along as time goes on, and then I'm going to bring you an organization for your approval. And you know, I'd informally meet with them every once in a while, maybe over lunch or something, and say, okay, I'm 3 or 4 weeks into this. Here's kind of where I am. Here's where my head is. How do you feel about that? And by the time I took the structure to him, even though he had never seen anything formally before that, he was pretty much, you know, 80% of the way there anyway. And then I'd present the structure and hopefully get approval on it. Once you have that, and again, this is my preference, but once you have that, I think you need to move quickly. You have an organization chart in front of you, and it's dynamite. If it gets out without, you know, being properly controlled, in other words, if it gets out some other way than you as the #1 tax person, you could have a problem. And these things can spin out of control very quickly. And you know, what you need to do as soon as you have approval from your boss, and that means you have approval from these other departments that you had to meet with as well, then you know, move quickly, have a department meeting, and bring it out as quickly as possible. All right. Any comments or differences of opinion on that, or different approaches that you all have taken?
I think the only thing I would add myself is we had to do something similar, and the one critical factor was once we had the positions marketed and we had, you know, the short list of applicants and someone that we were willing ready to extend an offer to, you've got to make sure you've got buy-in from not only your boss, but also HR and all of the levels of people that need to get that offer letter in the format that's acceptable to your candidates and get the people on board quickly. As we all know, we have to move swiftly once we have warm bodies that, you know, we think fits the bill. So that's the one thing I think I had to, there's a lot of people that have to sign off and to get someone in the door. And so you just have to make sure everybody's ready to move quickly.
Well, my comment on that was that Kelly?
Yep.
Yeah, my comment on that, Kelly, is that my approach was I would meet with the head of HR. If it's a major reorganization, I'd meet with the head of HR. I'd go through the organization structure, and then if she said, okay, I'm on board, this is okay with me, then I would say, now please make sure your people are ready to go too. We're going to need these position descriptions. We're going to need that and this and all, but it's got to be done quietly in your organization. I don't want them reaching out to my people yet until we've announced it, but get ready to do this for us. And I'm counting on you to make that happen. I guess you can do it the other way too. Okay.
No, we had the same thing. We had the same buy-in from the top, but you're exactly right. Their people have to be willing to do everything they need. You know, HR quickly learns, I think, along the way as tax is needing to add people. They quickly learn how hard it is to find the right talent for certain roles and levels of expertise. And so usually I found they reacted pretty quickly once they saw that the difficulty to getting the right talent in the door. And so that's how we really made it happen quickly.
Right.
Mike, I have a question. Would you recommend for the people on the in the class that are not currently number ones, they're sitting in number twos, but they lead a group, and maybe they think they need to reorganize or restructure their group for whatever reason? Would you do something similar to this, but instead of going to the CFO, you're bringing your boss along, the head of tax? Would you take a similar approach in doing this, but on a smaller scale, or would you change the approach at all? Yeah.
No, I would, Adam. I would. Now, it's going to vary. If it's the smaller the reorganization, the less sensitive it is, and the more public it is. If you had somebody leave from a small group of 5 people, for example, then everybody knows something has to be done to fill that gap. And that's a smaller version of a reorganization, let's say, unless you look at it and say, well, nobody can fill that, or I have somebody over here and it's going to take a major reorganization within the group. You have some of the same sensitivities, but it's not as, I would say, dangerous an issue as it would be for a major reorganization, department-wide type of reorganization. But yeah, in general,
Sure.
I'd follow the same approach. And I did. Actually, over the years that I rose up through various organizations that I was with. So, I guess the point of this entire session is we've talked in the 2 sessions about, number one, what are the critical success factors for a number 1 tax position? What are the critical success factors for the tax department? And how do you organize the tax department to get there? So, to be successful as a number 1, you need to have identified what those critical success factors are for that position. Make sure they're aligned with the critical success factors / objectives for the tax department, so everybody's pulling the same way. And then do your assessment of your department. And then based on that assessment, organize your department to go meet or preferably exceed those objectives. So once you have that chart, and once it's been approved by the boss, and once and everybody else that has to be approve it, and which by the way, I didn't mention it, but it could include the general counsel. But once you have all of that done and you trot it out, you announce it to the department, you're not asking for approval from the department at that point. You're saying, I'm the leader, here's what we're going to do. Now everybody needs to join the team, and we all need to pull together in this organization, which I believe is the right organization, for these objectives. And here are the objectives. And then it's just a matter of executing from, and that, sounds a lot easier than it is. I know that. And your job at that point is to start coaching and ensure your managers and people down below you are coaching and bringing people along as well. So that's where we are now. Our last slide here, and we talked a little bit about that before, is financial reporting. Financial reporting, and I'm not telling you guys anything, but financial reporting is an issue out there that some tax departments manage themselves, others do not. Some tax departments manage part of it, or all of it. But in any case, while the basic tax work of the tax department is to minimize taxes, well, not minimize, optimize your tax position, and then report it properly, defend it on audit, et cetera, et cetera. Whatever you do in the tax department can have serious consequences on the company's financials, good or bad, can cause surprises, which of course nobody likes. And the point of this slide, when Tony and I and Tim Ergo a year ago were working on this, we decided that the point of the slide ought to be, you need to keep this in mind the entire time you're doing your reorganization, because some of this, with respect to financial reporting, will affect your organization, but you may not have that kind of control over it. And you're going to have to work with your chief accounting officer, your controller, or whoever it is, maybe the general counsel, to ensure that this is properly considered in your reorganization. All right. That's what I have. Adam or Tony or anyone else, if you have questions or comments or criticisms, and again, there are differences of opinion on some of this stuff. So if you have it, bring it up for the benefit of everybody.
Hey, Mike, this is Rob Laudeman. Just a comment getting back to the skills. We struggled with HR, like sounds like many have, and including benchmarking and getting that aligned to what we were seeing in the tax marketplace. So we spent part of a year developing a tax career path grid that took the HR competencies measurements that the company was using, kind of you said the company policies, and then translating them into tax language by levels, using benchmarks from accounting firms, from Tax Search and others to kind of really took it upon ourselves. And we used that as a tool with the HR department. And we also went through their benchmarks and kind of tested the benchmarking descriptions they were using. We found that many of the HR benchmarks were broader finance benchmarks being applied to tax. So we really took a deep dive with HR, kind of the partner, and saying, hey, help us understand your benchmarks. So those were a couple of things that we found successful in getting HR to partner with us and understand the tax organization.
It's a great point, Rob. It is a great point. It takes more time, but again, I think tax organizational matters are like I said earlier, one of the most important things you and the tax department can do. It is what drives your effectiveness in the future. And the kind of stuff you're talking about, it's unfortunate that you have to do that because it does take time away from other things that you might want to be doing, but it's a pretty important task. And yeah, if they'll let you do that, that might be well worth the time.
And I'd say the investment paid off. That was about 6 years ago, and we've continued to use that benchmarking or the career path grid that we created both with HR. It actually got picked up by some other finance functions like treasury and external reporting that were technical specialists as well. So it paid a lot of dividends. I agree, Mike, it was an investment of time, but it paid off a lot of dividends over the years.
That's good to hear. Terrific. Anybody else done that or had that type of experience?
I just wanted to make one more point about the understanding of financial reporting slide. This is Kelly. One thing we did is we did joint meetings partnering with the reporting team to ensure that everything was covered and we were integrated or working well together. And then lastly, I think everybody's always seen is the tax accounting, tax accounts, getting authority to review and sign off on all journal entries and own those tax accounts, ensure that nobody else is booking things to them that you're not aware of. So that's one of the last controls that we had to instigate. I've done it multiple places, but here it's been very critical.
Yeah, and I'll I'll follow up on that point too, Kelly. It goes back to a point I think you made earlier, or that we discussed. Relationships really matter. You know, I think about some of the really important relationships that tax number ones have, and you can start with your chief accounting officer, your controller. Start with that person and that entire department. If you've got a poor relationship with that individual, you've got to get over it because there's too much hand in glove work that has to go on between the two departments. That goes for other departments as well, but that's one it's critical.
So one of the things I wanted to bring up on the benchmarking and assessment side that we've seen, and you'll notice in our organizations, you'll never see us put out, here's the annual compensation levels, or here's the optimal organization charts for a particular type of company. The reason being is things move rather quickly. I mean, to give you an example, if you would have done benchmarking on what a transfer pricing person comp levels would have been the fourth quarter of last year before tax reform came out, it not only would have been low, but the attitude about it would have been you probably can get away with cheaper than that because there's going to be less of a demand on transfer pricing based upon what everybody was thinking was going to happen. Now, fast forward 9 months later, and transfer pricing compensations are going up rather dramatically, probably double the rate of the average tax comp level. Shortages everywhere. We would have had that same issue on tax accounting reporting where everybody thought that once we got past SOX and we integrated tax accounting reporting changes in, everything was going to settle down, right? And we were going to automate and we were going to have less people and less costs. And the dynamics of a candidate-driven market versus an employer market. We're clearly in a candidate-driven market in tax right now. Clearly. And the cost points are going up monthly, not just, you know, yearly, but monthly for certain people at this time of the year. Imagine trying to get a tax accounting reporting person right now and want them to start before year-end close, walk away from their company. 5 years ago, nobody would do it. Nowadays, candidates will do it. They don't feel the same loyalty, but to do it, they're going to cost you a huge premium. What's your alternative? Pay the public accounting firms to fill the role until then because the job's open. Go with a B candidate and then have a material weakness and have lose hundreds of millions of dollars of shareholder value. I stress to everybody that you can't build it and ignore it. Whatever you build, whatever Jamie built FedEx, that's phenomenal, and you should do exactly those types of things. But the market force is impacting them. You need to have your finger on the pulse. You need to talk to people who actually know what's going on, because I have a company right now. It's a Fortune 25 company, major acquisition, third one in a row. They thought they were going to retain their key people. They had it all charted out. I walked them through it, and I says, okay, you're basing this on the fact that you think these people are going to stay. Well, this guy's not going to walk away from a $500,000 severance, and this person at that level won't walk away from a $100,000 severance. And of course, they were making on average 25% more than their people were making. So the company they're acquiring was paying their people better. They handcuffed them what they thought they could handcuff them. And in this market, it didn't stop anybody. They lost in 35 days their whole income tax department. Oh. Now, right before year end. Every one of them gone. So there's six people living down in San Antonio from their legacy department trying to hold the fort together with a bunch of contractors from tax force in there helping them out to try to hold this thing down. And this guy, pretty intuitive in the market, but it slipped away on him. He didn't realize that people paid that well would find jobs that quickly, and they'd be willing to walk, or the companies would be willing to make up these walkaways. But they did. I wasn't on the other side. I didn't place them. I don't know how they negotiated those kind of walkaways, but they did. Whole department's gone. So not to scare everybody, but once you build it, you still got to keep your pulse on what's going on. And there's what I call lever points. Right now is a lever point. We're after major tax reform, regulatory. We have demographic issues impacting it. It's kind of reminds me of the late 80s after the 86 Act and what went on with technology developments. We'll talk about that in the outsourcing article too in a minute. But keep your eye on this market. It's highly, highly volatile. right now, and the supplies and demands are way out of whack in certain areas. So keep your ear to the ground and get a lot of good data from as many sources as you can.
Hey, Tony, this is Dwayne Short from Medtronic. What do you suggest? There's a lot of HR groups will say, well, we only benchmark every 2 years. What would you suggest for how you go in and say, we've got to benchmark more often? Because I think all of us have seen, you put offers out to candidates, they say it's too low, you go up as much as you can, and then you lose the person. And now all of a sudden you're trying to play catch up on that.
All right, so you got the timing, how often do you do these, and then it's the quality of them. I focus on the quality first. Most HR generic compensation studies are flat out wrong. They do it based upon titles and not what the responsibilities behind the person is, which I can go through many, many examples where the title in one company, even though it says Director of International, is completely different between two companies. Then you lose the qualitative data. An example, Medtronic's converting to an inverted structure complicates the tax position by 50% at a minimum. I tell every CFO and every CEO of that. Inverted structured sandwich structures, or Kelly was talking about her crazy structure. It highly complicates. You need smarter people. You need better people. You have to pay at the top end. We went through this conversation when we were rebuilding Tyco as an inverted structure, when I built Neighbors, when we rebuilt Weatherford. When I rebuilt the Delphi that's now active tax function and they went through an inversion structure, it takes more horsepower, period. So one is quality of those comps that make sure you're getting true benchmark apple-to-apple comparatives to the roles. Then I do recommend normally every 2 years. I've recommended to my clients this year, everybody do them this year, because after tax reform, it's going to start to take off, and we're seeing it already. This fall is the busiest hiring fall I've seen in 35 years, period.
Wow.
Never been this busy in my life, and I have many more people than I used to have just to handle the workload. But the phone rings off the hook every night by about 5 o'clock to 6 o'clock, and it's some client. Last night it was a client with M&A director spot in New York, transfer pricing job in Dublin, senior manager in South Korea, 2 senior managers in Shanghai. Need them all now. We never used to get this in the fall like this. Spring, yes. Fall, no. So I would, number one, make sure you're getting accurate comp studies, Dwayne. Get them so they're both quantitative and qualitative in orientation. If you're hiring somebody that needs to get promoted 3 levels up, that's a qualitative assessment, and you need to have somebody capable of going in and telling you the person we're copying here, benchmarking, is actually of that ilk. So qualitative data and quantitative data, and then rep frequency at least every 2 years. When the market turns like it is now, I do it every year.
Okay, thank you.
Yep.
Sounds like I need to come back out of retirement, Tony.
We'll get you going, buddy. Hawaii only, though, right? I know the job spec.
The other thing that I guess, Tony, we talk about a lot is you don't have to benchmark every single person in your department. You pick the 20% of the people who are adding the most value, and you benchmark those key people, and then you can adjust off of them for your other folks. So that's another thing to keep in mind is if you're worried about cost of doing it every year, you can select the really, really, really important ones, and then, adjust other positions off of it. Anybody else have any other questions or comments or anything they'd like to bring up to the group?
Maybe one last point, Mark, is that, Adam, sorry, there's data out there about the risks of financial statement SEC reporting risks. And one thing that I used to help bolster us in getting the right amount of resources and talent is there's a lot of surveys out there about number one reasons for financial statement restatement. And I will tell you, you will find tax in that top percentage every time. And so those surveys do help, and they're eye-popping, actually.
A little frightening too.
Yeah.
Yeah, they are.
If nobody else has anything, Tony, I guess I'll let you start getting peppered with any questions anybody has about the white paper that we sent out about the outsourcing.
So guys, at the end of the day, this is probably one of the more risky situations for you. And you're going to find at some point as a number one, potentially your boss tapping you on the shoulder and saying, hey, I want you to take a look at something. And that something's going to be getting rid of your tax function to some degree. And it's going to be a big four that's gone up above you and approach finance with a broader scope. And of course, then immediately jumped on the tax side as an area they think they can automate, outsource for the most part, and create huge savings for the shareholders. They might come directly to you and try to get you to be supportive of it directly yourselves as well. They might come to you first, then go to your boss. It's a combination there, but it will happen. PwC's got their mobility group. Ernst & Young's got to call something else, reimagine the new tax function of the what century. The point I'm trying to make to everybody is this trend, which is there now. I've had many CFOs call me and ask about it. I've had many tax people say, hey, I'm getting approached to discuss this. What do I do about it? They use the examples of the GE one at first, where Davino, orchestrated that behind the scenes. Once I expose what's gone on there, most people get it and say, oh, okay, I see why that happened. The promise of technology being the savior of everything. We've all heard it before. Sure, it's very helpful. And this is not me saying anything against co-sourcing or outsourcing certain elements to third-party providers. My belief is, in the long run, it will not be an accounting firm. So this will probably shock some of you, but it won't after you think about it. I think we will outsource to technology players. It might be an Accenture. Hell, it might be a Microsoft, a Salesforce, an Oracle. That will do it really well. GM did not create Uber. Macy's did not create Amazon. No major real estate company created, Airbnb. If you're really good at technology and the technology is really what you're touting, that's fine. If it's tax services, that's a different thing. There's a lot of reasons why this doesn't work. It didn't work. We tried it in the late 80s and early 90s after the 86 Act, after we went through what I would call the first evolution of technology in tax, led by Arthur Anderson and their Sarasota group, PwC and their group up in Chicago with ITMIS and FITMIS. Anderson had Fast Tax. They evolved and developed into other platforms, as we all know. But none of those outsourced engagements stuck. BP didn't stick. Unical didn't stick. None of them did. They all went back and cost them a fortune to rebuild tax functions and gain credibility with people to say these guys are serious about being committed to a world-class tax function. And again, I don't want to separate that. I'm not saying there won't be technology developments and so on that's going to make your jobs easier and most of the stuff calculated. The first phase of shifting that work out was the shared services group, lower cost environments. Next, it might be to an RBA, right? AI focus to it. But you need to be prepared how to handle it, and you need some ammunition, just like Kelly was insinuating with some of the surveys and studies on the impact of tax. And she's absolutely correct. I've cleaned up the Tyco stuff. I've cleaned up Weatherford. I've cleaned up so many material weaknesses. It's crazy, and they cost shareholders a fortune. In the next session, you're going to hear that about the Weatherford story and how much money it was costing the shareholders and almost crashed the company, as it did Tyco before that. But when it comes to these outsourcing plays, it's an oversell and a simplification that doesn't hold up under scrutiny. The paper should help you have some ammunition. You need to use it. You guys need to be prepared. Just like selling and getting resources, you're going to need to sell to protect the tax department. Trust me. There's a reason these companies are coming after this revenue. They're desperate. I call them out on it. No one else will. But it's unfunded pensions, guys. These guys cannot pay their unfunded pensions to their partners. Ernst & Young capped theirs for their younger partners 2 years ago. PwC is pushing their partners out the door as we speak under something called Position Fit. They think this recurring subscription revenue from an outsourcing engagement is their answer, and they're going to go for it. So do not act surprised when it starts to be talked about in your company and your boss is dealing with it or you're dealing with it. These guys are going to come at you guys aggressively, and they're not going after small fish, I might add. I had a pretty in-depth conversation with a gentleman that, you know, if the tax departments they're going after would be really some of the Fortune largest employers. They don't want to go after the $4 and $5 billion company right now. They want to go after these big fish. So after they get, you know, KK, you know, they get Buffett's company and they get GE, they think they've got a great, and then they go after AIG and they go after Discovery Communications. So they're coming. You just need to be prepared for it. You need to get yourselves knowledgeable about how to counter some of this nonsense that will go on. Outlier situations, it might be okay to outsource a whole function for some reason temporarily for 3 years. There's nothing that I can tell you that doesn't make sense. Like I was just on the phone with one chief tax officer and she pitched that idea to management. They fired her. They actually walked her out the door after that pitch because she was having so much trouble staffing and retaining people. She tried to pitch the outsourcing as a solution to her issue, and she literally got a package to leave. So really interesting times. Be prepared. So if you don't have questions now, we're cutting short on time. Go to the webinar, ask some questions, reach out on the forum here. I'll answer them. But you guys need to be talking about this because it's going to be a major potential issue. I don't think this white paper is going to scare the big four away by any stretch. I'm telling you, they're coming, and they're coming to take your departments away from you, and they will not be good at it. Their KPIs and yours are completely different, but they'll sell it really well. Remember, they're salespeople. In-house corporate people aren't salespeople. There isn't a bunch of you guys who are Med-Ru-based, but you're going to have to get really good at it quick. Or you're going to find out they're going to take your department right out from under you with your agreement or without it. So if it doesn't scare you, it should. It might not apply to you in the next year or two. It might never apply to you, but there's a likelihood you're going to be exposed to it. So you can't go in it without being at least prepared. Does anybody have any questions now before we jump? Go ahead.
Tony, I was just going to say, you know, the last session, not this one, but the last one was a really good one for our leadership to tool up, you know, what are the key objectives that we can achieve as an in-house function, and then doing our own cost benefit analysis and what should be done in-house versus external. And you know, a big part of what we need to be doing every day is, you know, cost benefit of the resources that we have and what value we're generating, just like if we were in the top line. So, you know, just if you go back to what Mike said on that first call, a lot of that is, you know, where you got to spend your time. You got to work at selling your function, and that it's generating a benefit to the organization, either by way of tax risk mitigation, tax cash optimization, you know, and all of those things.
Yeah, 100% correct. Go ahead,
Dwayne, I think one of the difficulties is, of course, is that they come in with studies, a McKinsey study or whatever, and saying you should have X% based upon revenue or something. When you're faced with outsourcing, though, I think you might have to turn to and say, well, here's how we can optimize. Maybe it's shared services center for taxes. And Tony, maybe that's a separate topic that we can discuss at some time, because I've seen a few companies, and one of my prior companies did use an offshore compliance center in-house. So I think that the message is when they're saying, here's the value we can bring, but in a finance optimization context, here's how we can cut out costs and still add that value. I think, in other words, you have to come up with alternatives.
Absolutely. You can't just say no. You've got to say, here's what we're doing to reduce the cost and increase the value proposition. But I will tell you, the higher you get to communicate at the C-level, the more they're interested in increasing the value than reducing the cost. lower you're dealing with, the more they're focused on the cost and they kind of blow off the value creation. But if you can message it to the right folks at the value creation side, that you own the conversation, then you stay in control.
Yeah, and I think, Tony, you're exactly right on. You know, I've been there, done that. I've actually, you know, was 1 year I was handed the Global CEO Award by an inbound Japanese publicly traded company. It was $14 billion, and the next year I was walked out the door, and my whole department was gone. And that was KPMG, thanks to KPMG, coming in doing exactly what you just said to essentially a finance director that wasn't really a true CFO.
Yeah, it can happen to anybody. And the point that I think you made about selling it is absolutely correct. And Dwayne, it doesn't mean we don't optimize the costs. I agree, whether we're looking at shared services or I'm a big RBA guy. I think AI is going to help tax phenomenally, but I think you develop it in-house to a degree. People are scared of it. They don't think they can take people and train them on RBA and so on, but they can. Bots are not that complicated, and these people are smart and they can pick it up. Retool your people, get them ready for it. There's a whole bunch of things we'll talk about in next sessions, but yeah, we got to cut it on, grab it on both sides. But shareholder value overwhelmingly owns the conversation at the C-suite. And like I said, when I bring Ahmed in, he'll talk about that to you blue in the face. All right, Adam, I think that's it. And again, everybody's going to get an invite to the webinar. Feel free to jump in on it. If you want to post questions on the forum, we'll banty those around on the outsourcing. How do you rebuff? How do you insulate yourself from this? How do you prepare for it? That's really the key.
All right, guys. With that, we'll break. Just a reminder about session 3 on November 27th. You guys hold that in your calendar. You should get the official Outlook invite for that next week. And we'll talk to you in a month. Everybody have a great week.
All right.
Appreciate it, Mike.
Guys. Take care.
Thank you, Mike.
Mike.
Bye.
Bye-bye.